I promise I'm back. Good evening once again. Welcome to today's video where we are going to be looking at what we call the central nervous meninges. But please, if it is your very first time to watch, please make sure you first subscribe. You put on the notification bell so that whenever I load the video, you become the very first person to watch. So let's go ahead and get started and look at what we call the meninges of what we call the central nervous system. We need to first understand what meninges are. And of course, simply, meninges are going to be this kind of the protective layers, okay? The protective coverings of the brain and even also what we call the spinal cord. You're going to be having a lot of what we call the meninges, which are going to be lining what we call the brain and then the spinal cord. So let's go ahead and see the different meninges that covers the brain and then the spinal cord, okay? Now, when you see the whole of this structure, this kind of the structure is giving us what we call a coronal section, and we want to see how these kind of the meninges are going to be arranged in what we call the brain and then the spinal cord, okay? So now, the whole of this structure here, the whole of this structure is going to be now the cerebrum, okay? And then you're going to be having what we call the midbrain, okay? What we call the midbrain. You're going to be having the pons. Okay, we're going to be having the pons, medulla oblongata, and then the down transition from the medulla oblongata, which we call the spinal cord. Okay, and of course, these kind of the protective meninges are going to be running all around the brain and then the spinal cord. You're going to be having some kind of the differences somewhere, whereby we have some other layer which is going to be part of the brain, and we don't have that kind of the layer which is going to be in what we call the spinal cord. You shall see some kind of the differences in this kind of the meninges. Okay. Now, we need to first understand the whole of this kind of the blue structure, the whole of that kind of the blue structure. That whole of that structure is the tissue which we call the brain and then the spinal cord. Okay, we want to see these other coverings which are going to be protecting the brain and then the spinal cord. So now the whole of this kind of the brown structure is going to be what we call the brain. Is going to be what we call the brain, and even what we call the spinal cord, okay, which collectively we call the central nervous system. Okay, now we want to see the first kind of the meninges. We are going to be now arranging them from inside, from the brain and then the spinal cord, going outwards. Okay, that's how we are going to be arranging them. So now when you see this green meningel, okay, this kind of the green meningel, which is going to be running with the brain and then the spinal cord, the first innermost, that kind of the meningel is what we call the pia mater. Okay, is what we call the pia mater. Okay, that's going to be our first innermost meningeal layer, which is going to be adherent to what we call the brain and then the spinal cord. Now, coming out, we have this kind of the meningeal, which is going to be red. You see this kind of the meningeal, which is a bit red. Okay, this kind of the meningeal, which is very red, running all around, just next to what we call the pia mater. You know how this kind of the meningeal is called? This meningeal is what we call the arachnoid matter. Okay, this kind of the meningeal is what we call arachnoid. Arachnoid matter. Okay, is what we call the arachnoid matter. And the arachnoid matter is super unique in the way that it's going to be having this kind of finger-like projections. Okay, this kind of the finger-like projection. You know how these finger-like projections, how they are called? These kind of the finger-like projections are what we call the trabeculae, okay? What we call the arachnoid trabeculae. Super very important in anchoring between these two layers, which we call the pia mater and even what we call the arachnoid matter, okay? So now that is going to be what we call our second layer of the meningeal from the pia mater going outwards. Okay, then we also have this kind of the meningeal layer, which is going to be the outermost. Okay, it's going to be the outermost meningeal layer. You know how do we call this kind of the meningeal, which is going to be the outermost, which is going to be too hard, fibrous? This kind of the meningeal layer, the outermost, is what we call the dura mater. Okay, is what we call the dura mater. Okay, is what we call the dura mater. Now, The dura mater is going to be somehow a bit unique in a way that when it reaches around this area are always around what we call the longitudinal fissure. You're going to be having this dura mater separating. Okay, you're going to be having the dura mater separating. You're going to be having this kind of the dura mater which is going to be enfolding in what we call the mid-sagittal sinus, and then also have this kind of the dura mater layer which is going to be clinging on what we call the skull. Okay, so we are going to be having the dura mater separating at this area. We're going to be seeing when the dura mater separates, which kind of the two layers does it make. But of course, when you see the whole of this structure here, this one here, this is going to be now what we call the skull. Okay, it's going to be what we call the skull. Now, when you see this kind of the dura mater, that kind of the dura mater layer that is going to be adherent to the skull, you know how this one is called? That is what we call the periosteal layer of the dura mater. Okay, that one is what we call the periosteal, which is going to be now our number 2. Okay, it's going to be now our number 2, which we call the periosteal, which we call the periosteal layer of the dura mater. Okay, and of course you're going to be having this other layer which is going to be now helping in the formation of the dura which makes the dura infolding. Okay, this kind of the dura layer, this kind of the layer of the dura mater which is going to be enfolding in this kind of the sinus, helping in the formation of what we call the durovenous sinus. You know how this kind of the dura layer, how it is called? This kind of the dura mater layer is what we call meningeal layer of the dura mater. Okay, this number 1 is what we call the meningeal layer of the dura mater. Okay, what we call meningeal. Okay, what we call the meningeal layer of the dura mater, meaning that the dura mater in the brain is going to be having this kind of the 2 layers which are going to be formed in this kind of this area. This is super very important. We don't have this kind of the periosteal layer in what we call the spinal cord. Super very important. Okay, now I want to see in between these kind of the meninges, you're going to be having different kind of the spaces. Okay, well, let us go ahead and see the different kind of the spaces that are going to be in between these kind of the meninges. Now, when you see this brain and then the spinal cord, we said the first meningeal layer is going to be the what we call the pia mater. Now, just above the pia mater, we said we have what we call the arachnoid mater. But in between the pia mater and then arachnoid mater, we have a space, and this space is going to be a real space. How do we call this space? This space is what we call the subarachnoid space. Okay, so now this kind of the space between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater is what we call a subarachnoid. Is what we call subarachnoid space. Okay, and of course it's going to be within this kind of subarachnoid space where we're going to be having the cerebrospinal fluid running. We're going to be having this kind of the finger-like projection which we call the trabeculae, and even some kind of the blood vessels are going to be running within this kind of the space which we call the subarachnoid space. Okay, and also from arachnoid mater to the dura mater, we also have this kind of this space. Okay, from the arachnoid mater to the dura mater, how do we call that kind of the space? That space is what we call subdural. Okay, that space is what we call the subdural space. And of course, this subdural space is going to be a potential space. And when we talk of this potential space, is that that kind of the space is not going to be so much visible. It is so much visible in pathological conditions. For example, when we have such kind of the hemorrhage within that space, that's when we can see that kind of the space being visible. But in the normal circumstances, this space is not so much visible. That's why it's going to be a potential space. But subarachnoid space is a real space because it can be seen having cerebrospinal fluid circulating. This is such another beautiful thing. Okay. And then between the dura mater and the skull, we are also going to be having a potential space. Okay, also going to be having a potential space. And how do we call this kind of the potential space between the dura mater and then the skull? This is what we call epidural space. Okay, this is what we call epidural. Epidural epidural space. Okay, and of course we have said that this kind of the space is going to be so much visible in pathological conditions. For example, if you have some kind of the bleeding within the within what you call the epidural space. So now the bleeding in what you call the epidural space is just simply called epidural hematoma. Okay, and then of course the bleeding in subdural space is just simply called subdural hematoma. And of course bleeding in subarachnoid space is going to be what we call subarachnoid hemorrhages. Okay, we shall go later and see the difference this kind of the bleedings in great detail, and we see how they look for the case of this kind of different potential spaces and then the real spaces. Okay, so now let's go ahead and see these layers and some little bit of the description. Okay, we have said that the first layer inside we said is what we call the pia, matter. Okay, and of course it's called the pia matter. The word pia means soft. Okay, the word pia means soft, and then matter means mother. So now pia matter means it is the soft mother which is going to be taking care of what we call the brain and then the spinal cord. It is also such another beautiful thing. So now this pia matter is going to be a very thin, delicate, highly vascularized meningeal layer. Okay, this kind of is going to be what we call is going to be thin. Okay, it's going to be thin, delicate. Okay, thin, delicate. It's going to be thin, delicate, and then innermost. Okay, innermost. Okay, so now this pia matter is going to be very thin, delicate, innermost meningeal layer. Okay, and of course this kind of the pia matter is going to be running with the gyri and the sulcus. Okay, it is going to be running with the gyri and then sulci. Okay, it's going to be running with the gyri and the sulci. It is the only one of the most important meningeal layer that's going to be running with the sulci and then the gyri of the brain. Okay, and then another important feature with the pia matter is that it is highly vascularized. Okay, it is highly vascularized. Okay, and because of being highly vascularized, it is one of the nourishing component of what we call the brain. Okay, it's going to be nourishing what we call the brain and even also what we call the spinal cord, because we're going to be having a lot of the blood vessels within what we call the pia matter, and even also the pia matter is in the formation of one of these tissue that secretes cerebrospinal fluid, which we call the choroid plexus. So now this pia matter aids also in the formation of what we call the choroid plexus when it makes what we call the telechoroid. Okay, so now that's going to be now the little important information about what we call the pia matter. Okay, then when we come to the arachnoid matter, which is going to be our second meningeal layer. Okay, arachnoid matter. Okay, arachnoid matter. Now arachnoid matter, we said first of all is going to be our middle meningeal layer. Okay, it's going to be our middle meningeal layer. Okay, middle meningeal layer. And of course we have seen that this kind of arachnoid means more of spider. Okay, it's going to be more of spider. It's going to be having those kind of the projections. Okay, so it's going to be looking like spider. Okay, it's going to be looking like spider. And who is making it look like spider? We said it has this kind of finger-like projection which we call the trabeculae. So now it is looking like spider just simply because of what we call the arachnoid, trabeculae. Okay, arachnoid trabeculae. Okay, so now that is what is making it to look a bit like spider. Arachnoid is like spider. Okay, so now that's going to be our second meningeal layer. And of course we said the third one is what we call the dura matter. Okay, and of course the word dura means hard, and of course we say the matter means mother. So this is a hard mother that's going to be taking care of the brain and then the spinal cord. It is such another beautiful thing. So now, what is unique with what we call the dura mater? The dura mater, the first important thing to note is that it is going to be the hard, it is going to be the thick, it is going to be thick, hardest. Okay, thick, hardest, outermost layer. Okay, it's going to be the thick, hardest, outermost layer, and it's going to be made up of what we call it's going to be made up of what we call fibrous. It's going to be made up of what we call the fibrous connective tissue. Okay, fibrous connective tissue. And of course, it is this dura mater that's going to be aiding in the formation of what we call the dura infoldings, or what we call the dura septa. Okay, and of course, the dura septa are going to be so much important in limiting the over movement of what we call the brain, and even also formation of what we call the dura venous sinuses and all that. So we're going to be having a lot of what we call the dura infoldings, and they are going to be made of what we call the dura mater. And of course, don't forget that this kind of the dura mater is going to be having two kind of layers. Okay, you're going to be having what we call the periosteal layer, and even also what we call meningeal layer. Okay, and of course we said that periosteal layer is going to be clinging on the skull, while the meningeal layer is one which is going to be making what we call that kind of the dura infolding. Okay, so now that kind of the dura infolding which is going to be created here just in what we call the longitudinal fissure is what we call the phallux cerebri. Okay, so now you're going to be having what we call the dura septa, what we call infoldings, and of course we have said that that one which is going to be in the longitudinal fissure formed by what we call the meningeal layer of the dura mater is what we call the phallux cerebri. Okay, phallux cerebri. Okay, super very important. And then of course you're going to be having another kind of the infolding. You know, we are going to be having what we call the cerebellum. We're going to be having the cerebellum somewhere here. Okay, so now you're going to be also going to be having some kind of the infolding between the cerebrum and even also what we call the cerebellum. So you're going to be having that kind of infolding, separating these kind of these two parts, the cerebrum and the cerebellum. So now that kind of the infolding, which is going to be more of horizontal, this is what we call the tentorium cerebelli. Okay, is what we call tentorium cerebelli. Okay, cerebelli. Okay, so now we're also going to be having another kind of the infolding between what we call the cerebellum. Of course, we're going to be having the cerebellum, that kind of the infolding which is separating the two hemispheres of the cerebellum is just simply called the phallux cerebelli. Okay, it's simply called the phallux cerebelli. Okay, it is going to be separating the two hemispheres of what we call the cerebellum. And even also have another one which is going to be lining what we call the sella tachyca, where our pituitary gland sits. You know, that kind of the circular infolding lining what we call the sella tachyca. You know how that kind of infolding is called? That kind of the infolding or the dura infolding is what we call the diaphragma celli. Okay, that kind of the infolding is what we call diaphragma celli. Okay, is what we call the diaphragma celli. Okay. So now those are the four main dura septa or dura infoldings that are going to be aiding in separating different major parts of the brain, and even also trying to reduce to limit the kind of the movement of what we call the different parts of the brain, and even also forming what we call the dura venous sinus. We have said that this kind of the phallux cerebri is going to be helping in the formation of what we call that kind of the dura venous sinus, where our cerebrospinal fluid has to be drained. Okay. Okay. So now, just a very quick recap. We have said that the innermost meningeal layer, which is very thin, running with the gyri, and then the sulci for the case of the brain is what we call the pia mater. And of course, next to the pia mater, going outside is what we call the arachnoid mater, and the space between is what we call the subarachnoid space. And then we said the last layer outside is what we call the dura mater, which is going to be having two layers, periosteal clinging on the skull, and then meningeal layer that forms the dura infolding, which is going to be our durovenous sinus. Okay. And then, of course, we said that the space between the dura mater and then arachnoid mater is what we call the subdural space, and then which is going to be a potential space. And then the space between the dura mater and then the skull is what we call epididymal space, which is also a potential space. And these spaces are not so much visible. They are only visible in what we call pathological conditions, whereby there's some kind of what we call the bleeding. Okay. So now this has come to the end of what we call CNS Meninges. And please, if you think whatever I've talked is making sense, is adding to you, you are benefiting, please, you can support me. And that one you can do it by a couple of means. You like the video, you can comment down in the comment section, you can share this video to any person at whom you think that is in need of this video. And of course, don't forget at the end of it all, subscribe. Thank you very much for watching. It has been TUMNAD as always. Until we meet next time.